Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Asipem Kalisa, and I am from the Center for Postgraduate Studies at Rhodes University. And also thank you for waiting with us. I've seen on the chats that we also do have some of the international researchers who are joining us here today. Next time, I'll make sure that I actually state the 3 p.m. is the South African time so that everyone knows what time we are going to have our workshop. But nonetheless, we are really glad to have you today. And thank you very much for your continuous support when it comes to the programming of research engagement and research support at Rhodes University, particularly the Center for Postgraduate Studies. Today, we are meeting here under the topic Reflexivity and Quality in Research, and we are joined by Tracy Falcon-King, who will be facilitating today's discussion. Just before introducing Tracy and also handing over to her, I'd like to outline some of the things that you will see going on in the chats, including a reminder that the recording that we are currently recording of the seminar workshop is for archival purposes, and also it will be sent to all of you together with the presentation that Professor Tracy will be doing today. Again, I'll be sending out a link. This link is an evaluation link for all our workshops, and including this one. The link or the workshop or the form itself for the workshop evaluation is anonymous. So we would like to get your suggestions as well as what we can do to ensure that we do support your research journey more and more. So as I said, joining us today is Professor Tracy Falcon-King, who lectures in the psychology department and is a member of the Critical Studies in Sexualities and Reproduction CSSR Research Unit. Professor Tracy will be discussing with us the understanding of reflexivity and quality in conducting qualitative research, which can be daunting, but at least after this workshop, we'll be able to understand its importance, as well as we'll be able to implement it in our research and in our academic journey. Without wasting any time, over to you, Professor Tracy, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Oh, super. Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely, lovely introduction. I'm just trying to get to the first slide. There we are. I want to say it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm really open to us doing this together. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat, or you could just interrupt me. I really don't mind. I want us rather to think through this issue, because it's not an easy issue. It's something that I still grapple with in my research, and I think that's how it's meant to be. It's not an easy issue, it's a messy issue, it's a complicated issue, and I think that's the reason why it's very often quite difficult for us to think about. I have a poll that I'd like to launch quickly. It is about asking you how familiar you are with this idea of reflexivity. So if you wouldn't mind participating in that poll, the question is, how familiar are you with reflexivity? Once many of you have participated, I'll end the poll and publish it so that we can see. Also, if you'd like to introduce yourself, if you'd like to write something in the chat about where you are, your name, what department you're from, what you're working on in terms of reflexivity, if you're doing a master's or a PhD, or if you're thinking about this for an article, feel free to do that as well. Okay, so far we've had 22 participants. Just hanging on a little bit longer. I think we might have. Okay. A few more coming through the gate. Okay. I think that's sufficient for our purposes. I'm going to end the poll and share the results quickly. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see that, but the vast majority of you are familiar with the term. So we could say of the people who participated, almost 50% of you are familiar, but you don't really know what reflexivity means or how to practice it. Some of you have also read about it and thought about it, but very few of you have as yet actually written about reflexivity. Okay, hi Dom. Dom's from anthropology, and yeah, that's great. Thank you for joining. I have to say that I've had to give it a lot more thought in the last couple of days in preparing for this. Okay, so we're gonna finish with the poll now and keep going. What we're going to do in this presentation, I just want to try to get there, is the outline for the presentation for the next hour and a half is really thinking about what do we know. Well, that's kind of the bit that we've just done. We've realized that we kind of know about reflexivity, but we're not 100% sure how we'd go about actually practicing reflexivity in the process of doing our research. And so we're going to start off by doing the usual thing, looking at a couple of definitions and thinking about them. And then I would like to present 3 scenarios which are taken from different research papers, examples of researchers who have written about reflexivity and how reflexivity affected their research. And then to end off with, we're going to think about what do we need to do to develop our reflexive practices. And I think that's where I'm really going to be relying on some of you to give me some feedback. And based on what we've discussed, you can let me know. Okay. Right, so let's move on straight away. Not sure why this thing is like not going unless I bash it. Okay, so you might be familiar with Willig. Willig writes a lot around qualitative research design and data collection. And I quite like her definition of reflexivity. So she talks about personal reflexivity and epistemological reflexivity. And we're going to go into that a little bit more and also talk about why today we really are only going to be focusing a bit more on personal reflexivity. So reflexivity is important because it encourages us, as you can see on the screen, to foreground and reflect upon the ways in which the person of the researcher is implicated in the research. And it's not always easy to focus on ourselves and to reflect on ourselves, especially if we come from a more kind of natural sciencey background where we've been trained, or maybe we could say a mainstream background even in psychology, where we've been trained to think of the researcher as somebody who is detached, neutral, unbiased, you know, one of the research instruments that doesn't get involved, that has to observe the research process objectively. Okay, so reflexivity is not about that at all. Reflexivity is really about understanding how we are part and parcel of the research process. But the thing that I'd want to focus on today as well is cautioning against going to the other extreme. So the other extreme is sometimes when reflexivity becomes like a confessional, where people talk about the way in which they have affected their research, and they acknowledge their personal biases, and they think about themselves, and they think about their identity categories, and they write at length about those things without really taking it to the next step. So that's what I call kind of a confessional, woe is me, sorry that I am this kind of reflexivity. And that's not very useful. You know, it doesn't really help us when we are reading about your research, reading your thesis or reading your article, to really understand why. Why do we have to acknowledge who we are in this research process? It's not just enough to say this is who I am. We have to take it to the next step. Okay, so stop me if you have any questions, or pop them in the chat, or just interrupt me. Okay, so as I said, Braun and Clark have written this wonderful book as well about qualitative research, which we often use in psychology. And they also distinguish between epistemological reflexivity and personal reflexivity. Okay, this is not reflexology. This is reflexivity. So epistemological reflexivity is really what I would imagine we would engage in when we talk to our supervisor, when we decide on our research question, when we decide on what methodology we're going to use, what theory, what approach, what method, and so on. Those are epistemological questions, and we reflect on those things in terms of trying to think about which is the theory, which is the method that will best answer our questions. And how, as the example is on the screen, how would using a focus group be different to using researcher-directed diaries, for example? How would using face group posts be different to using interviews, and so on? So that's really what we refer to as epistemological reflexivity, where we are thinking critically about why we're making an argument for this theory, this method, and so on. That's not really what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about personal reflexivity, and that's about bringing you as the researcher into the research, making ourselves visible as part of the research process. And we mentioned how in quantitative research, very often the researcher is typically invisible. But at the very least, when we are engaging in personal reflexivity, we have to acknowledge who we are as researchers and acknowledge how who we are as researchers might impact on the research process. Now, I understand that for some of you, you might already be doing quite critical research, which includes this in a very big way. But there are some who might be doing research in a way which kind of makes this kind of personal engagement quite difficult, and one doesn't know where to start and where to stop. So that's what we're going to try to focus on. So personal reflexivity can be defined as a thoughtful and conscious self-awareness. It's not just about constantly thinking about our own subjective responses to the research, to the question, to the context, to our participants, to whatever it is that we are engaging with. It's also about the intersubjective dynamics and about that research process itself. So things that happen along the way, we need to engage in and with. And towards the end, we can talk about how to do this. But the most common way to do this, I think, is through the keeping of a research reflexive journal, where one is constantly thinking about yourself, who you are in relation to your research, where you are constantly recording things that happen in the day-to-day engagement with your data, and things that happen as you complete your analysis, things that you reflect upon. I'm just going to check the chat. Yes, the presentation will be shared. Okay. So something that I find very useful when I try to talk to students and when I try to think about my own reflexivity is to use this idea of subject positions. Who am I and who is the other in my research? So basically, reflexivity is a process where you come to terms with your own privilege, okay, but you could also sometimes come to terms with your own oppressions. So your own privileged identities, whether those are class, race, gender, nationality, or educational background. Okay, so I think the fact that we are all in postgraduate studies means that we're already starting from a position of privilege in terms of educational background, right? we might be conducting research with people who don't have the same level of education as we do, unless we're conducting research with people who are in higher education. And many of us have often questioned our own legitimacy in the field and find ourselves wondering what right we have to enter certain communities, to write about their lived realities that we ourselves often do not experience. So this is a kind of a very common narrative in reflexivity, acknowledging the differences between the researcher and the community that the researcher is researching. So the researcher is continuously challenged with the implications of what their body represents. And sometimes their body represents difference. Sometimes it represents privilege. But I really want to emphasize here that sometimes the researcher is not experiencing a privileged subject position at certain times during the research. So on the right-hand side there, I've shown you how sometimes you have more power and privilege. Sometimes you might have less power and privilege, but throughout your research process, your power will shift as you experience more or less privilege as your location changes. So you might, for example, experience privilege in one context when you are interviewing a particular kind of person, and you might experience less privilege in another context. So the idea of privilege and oppression, I'm sure you're aware of the concept of intersectionality. It changes, it shifts as your context changes, as your location changes. It's not fixed, it's fluid and multiple. So there's that little picture of the chess pieces, and kind of the idea that you can reflect at different times and you can have more or less power at different times. So this is the idea of subject positions, and you might not understand this fully, don't worry. We're going to go into it a little bit more now. The idea of subject positions are very, very important and I think useful to think about when we're thinking about ourselves in relation to our research or our research participants. So now I'm going to give you a more obvious example. Okay, so positioning theory is quite an old theory which was started by or originally written by Hooray and Langenhoev, also by Bronwyn Davies in feminist research. So you might be familiar with Davies and Hooray's paper. And they write a lot about positioning theory, which is basically subject positions. How do people as subjects of a particular kind locate themselves and others, in language, in interaction? So now we are thinking about this in terms of research, but I want you to look at this picture. This is a picture of a medical interaction. I'm sure that you have recognized it as a medical interaction. And so when we think about medical consultations, going to see a health professional, we know that there are only so many ways in which those kinds of interactions happen. Okay, generally, when you go to a medical professional, the medical professional asks you questions and you respond to those questions. They then make a diagnosis and they might make a recommendation or prescribe some medication. You don't go to a medical professional, make your own diagnosis and prescribe your own medication, or ask the medical professional personal questions about their health conditions. So there are a particular kind of rules which govern how medical professionals and patients interact with each other. There are also different kinds of positioning. So for our purposes, we're just going to look at these three: imperative positioning, interactive positioning, and reflexive positioning. So imperative positioning is how an individual is already positioned by society. In other words, the assumptions that we make about people of particular kinds. So that would be kind of the stereotypes that we draw on, maybe our personal biases that we draw on when we see particular kinds of people, we make assumptions about them. And so when we go into the research field, we might make assumptions about the people that we are researching, doing our research with. Interactive positioning is in an interaction like the one I've just spoken about, where the medical professional might position the patient as needing help, and the patient might position themselves as needing help, and might position the medical professional as somebody who has the expertise and has the knowledge to give them the help that they need. Okay, so that happens in interactions. So this positioning happens in language, and it happens in actions that take place in encounters, in the way that we locate ourselves and others. So imperative, interactive, and reflexive. So I'm going to give you some examples of an imperative positioning, for example. And then I'm going to ask you to maybe think about it and write an example that comes to mind in the chat. So let's pretend that the patient here, who is the older woman with the pinkish reddish shirt, polo neck, the older woman who seems to be the patient. What if she said to the medical professional, "You look too young to be a doctor. How old are you, my girl?" So that is a positioning. She is positioning the medical professional here, the doctor, as too young. She is, by doing that, questioning her expertise, right? In the interaction, the young woman might say, "I've been a doctor for 10 years already. In fact, I'm about to qualify as a specialist." So she responds to being positioned as somebody who might lack expertise by reinforcing the fact that not only does she have experience, but she's about to qualify as a specialist, okay, as someone who has a lot of expertise and knowledge. Imagine if the young woman said to the older woman, "You remind me of my grandmother. She also suffers from arthritis." Okay, so here the younger woman might be trying to kind of connect with her patient, saying something like, "You remind me of my grandmother." But of course, when she does that, she's also kind of acknowledging that the patient is older. Okay, and she's trying to kind of create a connection and kind of have a relationship of respect with the older woman. And then the older woman says to her, "Oh, does your grandmother also forget to take her medication?" So there she's kind of being reflexive and positioning herself as a forgetful person, okay, which is forgetfulness is something that we associate with older people, okay? So I'd like you now in the chat to imagine how the young woman as the doctor, the older woman as the patient, might interact with each other, how they might position each other imperatively or interactively or reflexively. I'd like you to give that a try. Tandakazi is saying, "As a young doctor, I get this all the time." Yes. Now I'd like you to think about what we've seen here are two women. One is a young woman is an older woman. One is a black woman, one is a seemingly to be a white woman. So how does this impact on the way in which they might position each other? Okay, what are the assumptions, imperative assumptions, interactive things that might take place where they might position each other? So I'm trying to give you examples here of how it can happen in a way which might be problematic and difficult, but they might also interact and position each other in ways in which they're trying to create a connection or have a better relationship or feel, that they're treating each other with respect and so on. So when we're talking about reflexivity here and imperative positioning, we're not always saying, that we need to be aware of people's biases or prejudices only. Sometimes that kind of positioning might happen in a way that we might think is kind of positive, as in trying to establish a relationship, a connection with the person that you are interacting with. So is there anybody who wants to talk, or is there anybody who's going to write something down in the chat about what you could imagine the older white patient might say to the younger black doctor? And how that positioning might affect the relationship. Any takers? Okay, the interactive
Hello?
one. Hi there.
Sorry, were we supposed to raise our hands or something?
No, I just thought maybe you'd write it in the chat, but you could interrupt. I don't mind at all.
Oh, okay. So I want to understand the question, right?
Yes.
So the task is for us to figure out exactly what are the dynamics happening between the two people in the situation.
You can't figure them out because they could be anything. I'm asking you to be creative and imagine what they are. Give me examples of what they could be. We're not saying they are, we're just saying this is what could go down. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just asking you to imagine a conversation like the one that I gave you, where the older woman said, "You look too young to be a doctor." Okay. So somebody has asked about interaction. And so interaction, I suppose, Carla, is just when it is kind of a mutual positioning, where I position you and you either resist that positioning. So the older woman says, "You look too young." The younger woman says, "Oh, I've been a doctor for 10 years already." So she resists that positioning of lacking expertise, of lacking experience, by countering it and saying, "Oh, I am actually, I have 10 years of experience and I'm about to become a specialist." So that interactive can be any kind of positioning. It can be imperative positioning or reflexive, but it happens in an interaction. So Dominic is saying, let me just make this a bit bigger, saying how young the doctor looks, and this could be interpreted by the doctor, who often feels undermined by others because of her age, because of her gender, and because of her race. Okay, that's a very good point, and I'm sure that could be interpreted as undermining, definitely. "Oh, my daughter, you are the one who has been sent to see me." Okay, so the older woman might see the doctor as her daughter and as being somebody that, she's happy to be seeing. Okay, you're all giving it a go. The elderly lady could get defensive and she could say, "Oh, but I'm trying to compliment you. I'm trying to compliment you because, we associate youth with kind of a positive thing." The elderly woman may ask the doctor where she studied. Okay, this could also be undermining, asking her, "Oh, where did you get your degree from?" Trying to kind of make her justify, acknowledge her expertise, kind of explain herself. And then we have to ask ourselves, would the older white woman be doing that if she was being seen by an older white doctor? Okay, so those are the questions that we're trying to think about here. Okay, we're trying to think about how age, how race, and gender might impact on that medical interaction. Oh, you're all getting into the swing of things here. Okay, so on the other hand, the patient may have a lot of confidence in the young doctor. She might say, "Oh, my child, you've probably heard and learnt about all the latest medical breakthroughs. I'm so glad you're treating me for my arthritis, because that means I'm going to get cutting edge treatment." So the point that we're making here is that it could go both ways. It could go well, it could go badly, it could go any way. It really depends on how people use language in the interaction to position themselves and to position the other. So we've done this exercise just because I'm wanting you to get this idea of how we position ourselves, how we position others, not in medical interactions, but in research, and how that impacts on our research. Okay. So let's move on, because we want to get to the nitty-gritty of actual research. So when we are reflecting or doing reflexivity, when we are practicing reflexivity, we need to focus on positioning, and we've spoken about positioning. We need to focus on dual role tensions, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, and we need to focus on power differentials. And so right at the beginning, I mentioned to you the fact that reflexivity, it's easy to do reflexivity badly. You'll often see in a thesis or in an article where people are reflecting on their identity categories, but that's all they do. They say, I am this person, this person, this person, and so I am different from the community that I'm researching in this way, and they leave it there. So McLeod states, researcher reflexivity should address the interactional, the relational, and the power dynamics of the research at hand, rather than just focusing on a confession of emotional or discursive positionings. So sometimes people will write at length about, the way in which the research affected them emotionally. We're not saying that that is a bad thing, but we are saying, why are you doing that? What is the purpose of that? It needs to have a purpose. If you're going to talk about the fact that this research has affected your emotions, then you need to also explain to the reader why that's relevant. How did that affect your research? How did it affect the power? How did it affect the way you position yourself or other people in the research? Okay, so we've spoken a bit about positioning. Dual role tensions is about how very often when we are in the research field, we have this conflict between being a researcher and being something else. So in our role as a researcher, we might be positioning ourselves in one way, but in the world, we might position ourselves somewhere in another way. So I'll get to an example of that. Or we might be positioning ourselves as a researcher, but our participants see us as something other than researchers. Our participants might see us, for example, and expect us to behave in a different way. So for example, you might be asking a question in a research space, you might be conducting an interview, and the next thing, your participant reflects or gives you a very, very personal revelation. So they tell you something that they've never told anyone else. Now you are in a therapeutic space. This often happens in psychology, I think, because people hear the word psychology and they don't distinguish between research psychology and counseling psychology. So very often when psychologists go out into the field, we find that participants try to kind of utilize that space as a space where they can talk about their experiences, they can talk about their feelings, they want to create a safe space to share. Now, maybe it happens in other disciplines as well. I'm pretty sure it does. But then you have a dual role tension. You are a researcher, but the person that you're talking to is also wanting some kind of therapy, some kind of counseling, some kind of guidance, or something different from you than you would expect to give them in a research interview. So that brings up, issues that we need to be reflexive about. And then, of course, the last thing there is power differentials, right? So as we said, you have different levels of power as your identity to your research participants, possibly. And that is not static, it's not fixed. Sometimes you might have more or less power than your participants, depending on the context, depending on the questions, depending on a whole range of different things. Now, I'm sorry that this has been so theoretical so far. I promise you we're going to get into the practical. I just want to check on the questions. Okay, those were just more about the medical interaction. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that have happened in actual research engagements, research in the field. So the first story that I want to tell you is about a researcher that worked in the CSSR. His name was Melvin Chiweshe. Melvin identified as a man. He was an African man, a Black man, a Christian man. And his research was about termination of pregnancy. So he went to Zimbabwe and he interviewed women who had experienced termination of pregnancy and who had had to make a decision about whether or not to terminate the pregnancy. Okay, I will talk about dual role tensions now because it's very relevant to what we're talking about in terms of Melvin's story. So here's Melvin. He was, as I said, at the bottom there, you can see an African man who was using a feminist approach, and he was asking women about their experiences of termination of pregnancy. And he found himself being positioned as a man, being positioned as a Christian, and being positioned as a researcher. And in fact, all of those different positions were contradictory. Okay, so when he went to a conference, an international conference, a feminist researcher said to him, "Why are men always speaking for women and taking over women's issues?" So that was an imperative positioning. She was saying, "Melvin, you are a man. I really am sick and tired of men who do research on topics like termination of pregnancy because I believe that that is a woman's issue. And we are sick and tired of men doing research on women's issues." Okay, so in that case, he was being positioned as a man who shouldn't be doing research on termination of pregnancy. On another occasion, he went to church, and at his church, people were asking him about his research. And when they discovered that he was studying abortion, they said, "Oh my goodness, Melvin, we need to pray for you. You need strength. You need to know what to say to these women, how to save these women, because, as the church, we are against termination of pregnancy." So there he was positioned as somebody who kind of needed prayer and intercession. So you can see how those two positionings are very, very different to the way in which Melvin understood himself and his role as a researcher. So that's what we mean by the dual tension, okay? He was a man, but also a researcher doing what was considered to be a woman's issue. He was a Christian, but also somebody who was talking about and researching abortion and being in that space very, very accepting and compassionate towards these women who had experienced termination of pregnancy. So that position as a man in that space, in his researcher space, was very much in conflict with the way in which the people at his church were positioning him. Okay, so they were using imperative positioning. They were just positioning him. They were making assumptions about who they thought Melvin was and who he should be in the research interaction. So Melvin wrote this. There were constant questions about why, as a man, particularly an African man, I was studying abortion. People would react with shock when I mentioned my thesis topic. Much of this has to do with abortion not only being a stigmatized area and thus unmentionable in public, but also a women's issue. And I use Melvin's example, and I would encourage you to read that article because he wrote very beautifully about his reflexivity. He questioned himself. He said, "What gives me the right to go and talk to women who have had an abortion about their experiences?" And then he doesn't apologize. He says the answer to that is that I can. He acknowledges his privilege. My maleness brought me to this point. I had the knowledge and the resources needed to do a PhD, and I had gotten to that because of my privilege as a man. Looking at the question of why studying women's issues in this way has been a sobering reminder of how easily we forget and do not reflect and act on our privilege. I had never questioned why I was able to read at home and play He's talking about when he was growing up, without the added burden of household chores. In that way of thinking, I realized that I was a product of the thing that I was hoping to engage with. So that's just a really lovely example of how he spoke there, mostly about his maleness and his privilege as a man who was able to do research on this topic. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to the next little story. Okay, so this story is about a woman, and there's the reading, Bork, Butcher, Chisonga, Clark, Davies, and Thorne. And they were doing research. This was a woman who was doing research in a very difficult environment. She was going into this environment knowing that the women in that environment didn't have resources. They were experiencing poverty, they were experiencing violence. So the participant said to the researcher, "You are here for a reason. You are going to get me out of the shit. I know you're going to help me." Okay. And in this article, the researcher doesn't actually say how she responded, but she says, she reflects, she positions herself reflexively when she says, "I would leave in the bitter of the cold winter's evening, leaving the woman beaten, blue puck marks all over her face, her husband having walked away to socialize in the community as if nothing had happened. Children were hungry. Bare feet wandered around in icy rotten water lining the streets. I had to walk away over and over again. I had to go home. I went home time after time. I could only manage so much. Enough of today, this week, this research, this abuse. Enough of being a woman, a privileged woman. I had another life in lit up suburbia with a hot shower and a flat with security guards. This was my world." So can you see what I like about this example is that she doesn't just say, "I am this person." She talks about the fact that she struggled. She struggled this dual role of being immersed in this very difficult situation where she was gathering her data, of having the participants have particular expectations of what she could do. So very often participants position researchers as helpers, as saviors. And of course, we are expected to do research which brings about social justice. And I do believe that just the act of doing respectful research and publishing that research does contribute towards knowledge generation and social justice. But at the same time, we have to also acknowledge that sometimes we go into situations, we do research, and we might form relationships with our participants, but it's quite seldom that with, the click of a finger, we are able to change participants' life circumstances quickly. And that is a difficult thing for us to acknowledge as researchers. What can we do? What should we do? Okay, so I know that when we talk to people at social engagement, community engagement, we know that we need to be doing socially engaged research with communities. We understand that and we accept that. But to what extent do we have the power to bring about change when we are doing, for example, our master's or our PhD? Okay, when we're still kind of novice researchers. So if we can reflect, for example, on that interactive positioning, what expectations our participants have, what expectations we have, how difficult it is to negotiate those expectations, and that is another way of practicing reflexivity. What can we do? What should we do? What is a reasonable expectation? And I'm not saying this to you to make it more difficult for you. There's no easy answer to this. There's absolutely no easy answer to this. We don't want to be those researchers who helicopter in, who get data from people and, jump out of the community, never to be seen again. But at the same time, even if we formed long-term relationships with the community that we were researching, the chances are that change or social justice comes about. It's a very, very slow process. And sometimes for those of us who kind of, want to bring about change and are enthusiastic, that's a very hard thing for us to face. The truth of what can we do, what should we do, what is possible in this environment. Okay, so now I'm going to bring about the third little story. And this is a very good article. You'll see it at the end, written by Rochelle Chadwick. It's a very recent article. And she talks about the politics of discomfort. And it's a very, very useful concept. And basically, I'm getting to the point now where I'm explaining to you that this is not easy. Reflexivity is meant to make you feel uncomfortable. It's messy. There's no easy answer. So how do we deal with that discomfort? What do we do with that discomfort? So Rochelle Chadwick says the politics of discomfort is racialized, classed, and shaped by various modes of privilege. As a result, the politics of discomfort will materialize and resonate very differently for researchers and for feminists across race, class, sexualized, gendered, ethnic, disabled, able-bodied differences. So it doesn't matter who you interview or conduct a focus group with or do an ethnographic observation of. If you engage with anybody in your research process, that person is going to be different from you in some way. That difference doesn't necessarily create discomfort, but it often does. And it's different for everyone, just as we are different from each other. So what Rochelle Chadwick did was she interviewed women who were birthing and mothering. So she was looking at birthing and mothering experiences in South Africa. And she says, I encountered and spent time with women across a wide array of differences, including rich white women living in mansions in some of the wealthiest suburbs in Cape Town, middle-class women across racial divides residing in comfortable suburban homes, and extremely impoverished Black women living in shacks within informal settlements. I did experience research encounters with white middle-class women that made me feel uncomfortable. Now, earlier in this paper, she talks about the fact that she's a white middle-class woman, right? But that doesn't mean that all white middle-class women made her feel comfortable, okay? She often was different to those women in terms of ideology, in terms of belief systems, in terms of understanding mothering and birthing in a particular way. But she also talks about affective manifestations. Now, affective means kind of her emotions became involved. She was affected and kind of emotionally invested and feeling very uncomfortable when she had to go into informal settlements and interview young Black women in contexts of extreme poverty. And she writes very beautifully about interviewing a young woman who on the face of it seemed so happy, but was clearly living in an untenable situation where while the interview was going on, there was, violence happening in the room next door and kind of crime happening down the street, and where she had to witness, hunger and kind of suffering. And so doing research in these contexts is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, because it enables us as researchers to reflect on, those discomforts and why we feel uncomfortable, and what do we do with that discomfort. That's probably the most important thing. What do we do? So she talks about the politics of discomfort and how she wrote about it in a research journal, how she sat with it, how she realized that she was an insider in that she was also a mother. She'd also gone through birth. She'd also experienced motherhood. Often she was kind of the same class as people she was interviewing. But then how, in some ways, she was also an outsider. So when she was going into informal settlements, she was very much a raced and classed outsider in those contexts. So what is it about that that makes you feel as a researcher uncomfortable? That those politics of discomfort, how can we write about them in ways that move beyond, oh, woe is me, I am this, and I'm kind of, she wasn't expected to make an apology for her privilege. She's expected to unpack her privilege and to understand how her privilege might have affected the research process. So that's the most important thing to think about. Okay. I'm just wondering now. Yes. So now we're going to come to the point where we think about how do we write about reflexivity? And once again, I'm referring you to Willig. I referred you to Willig right at the beginning, where she talks about how you can discuss reflexivity. So what I'd like you to do now in the chat is to think about, if you have to try to be reflexive as you gather your data and analyze your data in your qualitative research. Can you give me some examples in the chat? Or you could just put on your mic and chat to me some examples of how you would go about being reflexive. What kind of practices can you engage in that will help you to write about your reflexivity? Okay, I'm going to leave it up to you in the chat. The most common way of engaging in reflexivity is to keep a research journal where we reflect on ourselves, on our feelings, on the power differentials, on the dual role tensions, speaking to mentors about your experiences. Wow, that's a very good example, Carla. Yes, that's a very good, sometimes we're not quite sure what it is about an interaction that is speaking to us. We know that something happened and we might write about it in our journal, but very often when we speak to a mentor or to a supervisor, they might say, what you're experiencing, and they might be able to give it a name, or they might be able to relay you to or refer you to a reading that might help you to understand that a little bit better. So speaking to someone, speaking through these things is a very, very good idea. And I hope that all of you have research groups, reading groups, or groups where you get together on a regular basis to talk about your research, because those are great spaces where you can say something like, this happened to me. For example, when I was collecting my data, I collected my data in a public health clinic, an antenatal clinic, in fact. And every time I arrived there, the guard at the gate would call me doctor, okay? As a kind of older white woman, his assumption was that I was a medical doctor and that I was coming to the clinic, to help women give birth or to help women have antenatal care. At that time, I was only working on my PhD, so and then once I was in the hospital, I would be sitting in the waiting room. And it's very, very obvious to most people who know me that I'm well past childbearing age. So I was sitting in an antenatal clinic, even though I was not in need of antenatal care. right? So I understand about antenatal care. I've had children, I've had antenatal care, but my experience of antenatal care was very much kind of in the private medical space, not in a public clinic where I was collecting my data. And interestingly, some of the people who did not know that I was there for research, one of the doctors said to me afterward when I interviewed him, "Oh, are you here for research?" Well, I was trying to avoid you because, you know, the white patients are the worst. They have such a sense of entitlement. So what I'm trying to explain is how I was misrecognized. I was imperatively positioned by the guard at the gate as a medical doctor. And inside the clinic, I was misrecognized as a patient who might think that I was entitled to a particular level of care. So those kinds of misrecognitions enabled me to understand how I, as a middle-aged white woman, was impacting on my research in that context. Okay, so Nikita also says, I use my methodology section to discuss the difficulty in getting access to a suitable organization as an outsider. Yes, very often we experience a great deal of trouble trying to get access to organizations. I also experienced a long, protracted period of having to get permission from the Department of Health. All I can say, Nikita, is it is difficult, but keep writing about it, because very often that reflexivity that you engage in and why it's so difficult to get access and what happens once you do get access results in rich kind of information, insights that you can use to write an article, you know. So I actually, because of my very difficult ethical issues that I experienced because I was trying to get access to teenaged pregnant women in a public antenatal health clinic, there were a lot of complications, but because of that very difficult process, I was actually able to use those insights to write an article about reflexivity and about ethics. So, you know, try to think about it that way. Difficulties often lead to very fruitful insights that you can use. Anybody want to give us another example of what you could do? Willig suggests, you know, that you can integrate reflexivity in your thesis in a number of different ways. For example, as Nikita said, most of us have a section called reflexivity, you know, and we have it there at the end, close to the end of our methodology when we're talking about, you know, the rigor. We're talking about credibility and trustworthiness and so on. Then we talk about reflexivity. But it doesn't only have to be there. I have seen PhDs, for example, where people write a whole chapter on reflexivity before they write their methodology chapter. In other words, where people have so many issues around power differentials that actually they need to explain to the reader upfront exactly why this is such a difficult context. And so they kind of insert that information before the method chapter. You can also revisit reflexivity many times. So there are ways of highlighting and differentiating reflexivity considerations. So Willig says, for example, you know, you can integrate it, you know, if you're thinking about epistemological reflexivity in your theory chapter, of course, in your method chapter, and constantly as you are getting findings in your findings chapter as well. So there's no set format. Basically, that's what we're saying. The way in which you can write about reflexivity really depends on what works best for the kind of research that you're doing, and you know how you want to make it most accessible to your reader. Okay, so to keep that uppermost in your mind, how can I talk about reflexivity in a way which is natural, in a way which is kind of organic? And so the important thing is to include reflections in a way that is clear, that is honest, but also that is informative. So it's about that why. Okay, so here we've got some examples. In my introduction, I wrote about who I was and how my way of being and experience the world may influence why I had a particular interest in the question that I was trying to answer. That's beautiful, Alison, and I think that's very, very valid. So there's an example of how right up front you are saying to the reader, this is who I am, this is why I'm doing this research. So you can see how this is very different from a kind of a very, shall we say, mainstream, quantitative, objective idea of research. Right from the start, you are acknowledging that you have a vested personal interest. So it's not about hiding that. It's simply about acknowledging it in a way that talks to the rigor of the research, in a way that doesn't kind of minimize your role in the research and how you influence the research. So that's excellent. It's a very good example of how you could do it in the introduction, maybe not so much in the literature review, but definitely in the theory and methodology and findings and analysis. And of course, in the conclusion, there is plenty of room there as well for you to reflect on, the knowledge that you have generated and what that means and how you are implicated in that knowledge. Is there anyone else who has an example, or maybe this is where we should open it up to kind of talking? We could even talk on Zoom if you want to put your thing on. Okay. Dominic says, I did some research with subsistence fishermen about their experiences during the hard COVID lockdown in the area I lived in. This happened because they knew me already as a customer for their fish, and they approached me to assist in pleading their case with private security firms and police when they were chased away from the river. I recognized my privilege as a proficient English speaker and a professional middle-class person who could command more respect. When I wrote up the research, I noted that this demonstrates much about the ways in which cultural competency in English and class privilege are key to accessing justice. That's a lovely example, Dominic. Yes. I mean, I think this is the kind of privilege that I'm talking about, that we almost all of us automatically have as researchers, because we have kind of a high level of education and we have kind of are generally professionals, middle-class people who have the ability to write, to intercede, to communicate with authorities. I experienced a very similar thing in the hospital. In the hospital, young women were often ignored when they were in labor. I don't know if you know about obstetric violence, but sometimes when young women are in labor, the nurses, for a number of reasons, might ignore them and blame them and shame them and punish them even, sometimes even physically. And so I also found that very difficult to witness. And I realized that even though I was supposed to be just observing, if I made one inquiry about, somebody needing attention, that person would be seen to, and I realized very quickly that I kind of commanded, I was listened to because the nurses saw me as somebody who had some power and who could report them and would be listened to, and so on. So that's also very complicating. It's a very complicating thing, and it's a very difficult thing to write about, but necessary, very, very important and necessary to think about and to write about. Of course, I want to remind you that sometimes we are positioned as having less power. So sometimes there were conversations in the antenatal clinic which were in a language that I didn't understand. And I knew that these young women were talking about me or talking about the nurses, or talking about my relationship with the nurses, or whatever. But because I couldn't understand the language, and in that instance, you know, I had to reflect on the fact that I was excluded from those interactions. So one can't assume that because you are the researcher that you are going to have power and privilege in every interaction. There will be some interactions in which you will be misrecognized, dismissed, excluded. And it's important to write about those interactions as well. For my last slide, I have just, you know, I want us to think about what do we need to do to explore, what do we need to do now? How are we going to think about our own reflexive practices in relation to the research that we are about to undertake? So even though you might not be very far in your research, I'm sure that you might already know about potential tensions or power differentials that you are already aware of. So you might know that you are going into a community where you might not be fluent in that language, or you might know that you are going into a community where you are going to be recognized as a professional person, where you are going to be expected. There are going to be certain expectations that will come because you inhabit that subject position. So, you know, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic status, your ability status, your age, your citizenship, your sexuality, your religious beliefs, all of these intersecting identity categories can affect how you position yourself, how your research participants interactively position you, how you might be imperatively misrecognized and positioned in a particular way. And you might only find out about that through conversation later on. But all of these things are things that we need to think about and kind of be attuned to even before we go into the field. So it's a good idea to prepare yourself before you have your research data collection interactions, and to think very much about your identity and these categories and how that could have an impact on your research. Just excuse me for a second. Sorry, I had a cough. So is anyone willing to share if they are already aware of any potential tensions or differentials that they might experience in the field? Maybe this is an excellent opportunity for you to share that, and for us to maybe, you know, this is a friendly space. We could think about it and talk about it. If anybody wants to share or pose a question. Thank you so much for those of you who've already written. Those are very, very useful. And I hope that we can keep them as well, you know, in the recording. Oh, okay. So that was about the older woman and the younger woman. Okay, there's a new message. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see raised hands. Please unmute yourself and speak, May.
Oh, hi, hello.
Hi there.
I'm Tando. I am a second year PhD student at the anthropology department.
Yes.
And so I'm doing research looking at how indigenous healing cosmologies are
Yes.
used within a Xhosa landscape to manage and treat intergenerational and historical trauma.
Okay.
So I'm doing this research as a specialist within the Indigenous medical space because I'm a traditional doctor.
Okay.
And I'm a traditional specialist. Even my qualification goes beyond that of a traditional doctor. I'm a traditional specialist.
Okay.
And I specialize in trauma. So here
Okay.
I am now as a specialist, right?
Yes.
Going into the community, researching with other traditional healers who
Yes.
manage trauma, who perhaps may not be specialists, but who may be just sangomas, traditional healers,
Yes.
traditional doctors. And so I'm coming in with this positionality, right, from a traditional point of view.
Yes.
Whereas now, as an academic,
Yes.
as an academic now, I feel that in a way I'm intrusive, right? By coming in as an academic and asking to engage with traditional healers and to ask them about their practices, right? And being somebody who comes from the Western trained field,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
Whereas now I'm aware of the relationship that Western medicine or Western healing has had on traditional medicine. So I may not be a Western doctor, right? I'm not a biomedical doctor, but I'm doing work towards a PhD, a doctor in some form within Western academia.
Yeah.
So now I do sometimes get that feeling that, okay, how will I manage that type of intrusion when I'm in the field? Right.
So
I cannot depend. Sorry?
No, sorry. Carry on.
I was like, I cannot depend on thinking that, oh, I'm a traditional healer too, so we're just gonna vibe. These are my people, we're gonna vibe, they're going to share knowledge with me. I'm also aware of the fact that there may be resistance from some of my participants to share knowledge, right, with me.
Yes.
Because I come from the Western system, right? So I'm already coming from a system that historically has oppressed our people and oppressed our knowledge. So those are things that I'm now thinking about. Well, how would I navigate this when I'm on the field? And it's an anxiety that I have really, because I'm like, I don't think I can avoid it. But then the discomfort for me is that my own identity causes me discomfort.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you've hit the nail. Such a beautiful example of that dual role tension. You know, you've got a foot in both worlds, and how are you going to keep a foot in both worlds? Is the question you're asking yourself. And I'm glad that you're saying it's a discomfort, because I think that is, you know, those of us who do this kind of research, it's not spoken about enough, you know, this difficulty, this discomfort that you experience. It's almost as if you know, we need kind of therapeutic spaces to talk about this, because it's really at the heart of it a very, you know, very fundamental identity experience that you are going through, you know. And I wish that there were easy answers. and we all kind of have to find our own way, because there isn't a one size fits all answer. But I think I just want to say two things. The first is, you know, it is going to be messy, and you're not going to get it right all of the time. There will be some people who will imperatively position you, you know, and make assumptions about you as a specialist, as somebody who has more status than they have, right? And then there will be other people who might not do that, and will engage with you kind of on what, you know, just kind of as you present yourself. So you won't get it right all the time. There will be things that you will have to learn the hard way. There will be mistakes that you will make. So I think it's important for us just upfront to accept that. And the second thing that I'm saying is that it's about relationships. And this is why, you know, if you are able to form good relationships with people that you are researching with, then that makes your research stronger. Because if you can develop a relationship, those people can get to know you, can get to know more about this dual role, you know, can get to understand you, can get to accept you, and you them, you know. So if we conduct research kind of too quickly, parachute in, parachute out, obviously then those relationships can't develop, and we can't kind of be truly kind of reflexive about what happens in the field. And I know that sometimes time constraints prevent us from doing this, but yeah, just those two things, that accept that it's not going to be perfect, write about it as much as you can, speak to mentors about it, speak to your supervisor. I think that it's a very normal feeling to feel intimidated before you go in, because you already know that some form of trouble and discomfort is awaiting you. You know, we don't easily go into situations that make us feel uncomfortable. And this is going to be one that makes you feel uncomfortable. And I think this discomfort, this politics of discomfort, we don't talk about it often enough in research. And it's a very good thing for us to do that, and to theorize it, and to maybe write about it, so that other people who follow you, you know, can benefit from your insights. So thank you very, very much for sharing that excellent example. Somebody has said, I don't know who this is, BG, reflective practice can help us understand our own intentions, our own values, our own missions, and support us to work in a challenging field where our ethics and our morals may be tested, where power relations may be decidedly unequal, and where we may be working in emotionally and physically demanding environments. It aims to make you more aware of your own professional knowledge and action by challenging assumptions of everyday practice and critically evaluating practitioners' own responses to practice situations. Okay, so that's from Finlay. I'm aware of that paper. That's another excellent, excellent paper. I think that, you know, it is challenging. We have to question our assumptions all the time. And that's not an easy thing to do. I've often thought that, you know, when we fill in our ethical protocol, there's a big section on how are you going to protect your participants? What are the benefits to the research? How will you mitigate harms to your participants? But I honestly believe that we need a section that talks about harms to the researcher, that talks about how, you know, in grappling with some of these issues, we experience very often some kind of identity crisis work that we need to navigate, you know, because we come face to face with our own prejudice, our own assumptions, and we have to really critically evaluate who we are in that environment and what our identity means in particular contexts. And as this person said, Bulelwa said, you know, our intentions, our values, our visions, you know, sometimes we're not always honest about our intentions going in, and we have to interrogate those thoroughly. I'm so glad you've learned, Ruth. I hope everybody else has as well. I want to say that the next slide is just the reference list that I have there, those papers. If you're struggling to find any of them, please get hold of me, t.feltham-king@ru.ac.za. I'd really like to chat to any of you. This is a topic that I feel very passionate and very interested in. And sometimes all it takes is just talking through something. As I said, I don't have answers, but I'm very willing to engage and think through things. And I hope that all of you do have these kinds of spaces where you can follow up, think through things in a safe space. Because as I say, I think it's difficult work as a researcher, and all of us do go through it, and I don't think it's spoken about often enough. So I'm hoping that we can start this conversation and that we can continue this conversation as we go forward and continue doing our research. There's another comment. Oh, okay. Shall I post it here? Okay, this is my email address.
Hi, Tracy. I have a quick question.
Hi.
If there's
Sure.
still time.
There's time.
Yeah. So, and hi everybody in the room. I'm kind of in the end of my first year of a PhD in drama, and I'm looking at the intersection between like whiteness and racism and how those are performed.
Yes.
But my question is, I'm realizing that the more I read, I'm kind of developing a bit more of like a personal, either like an agenda or like just a stronger personal political view, which I haven't had before. And I'm just wondering, with relation to this topic about reflexivity, like, is that okay to kind of have a strong feeling about what you're researching? Because sometimes it feels good the more that you read, like things are making sense, like you're kind of creating a bit more of an opinion around your topic.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it might feel like, well, I'm just wondering, does that mean I'm kind of entering with an agenda already? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I identify with it as well. I mean, I think you're describing how you're finding your voice. You're finding your voice, and you've surveyed the terrain, all the other research that's been done on your topic. You've read this and you've read that, and you're starting to understand, imagine a geographical location, a map. You're starting to understand where you fit in on that map. Okay, so you've read those people and you might disagree with them, and you've read that group of researchers and you kind of agree with them, but you disagree with other things. And then you found these other people. I heard a researcher once say, when you find your voice, it's like finding where you belong. It's like finding your tribe, your people, And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that there's something wrong with people who do have a standpoint, but don't acknowledge their standpoint. But they have a standpoint anyway, So I think I would rather have a standpoint and acknowledge it up front and say, this is,
right.
And acknowledge it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's pretending to be neutral when you actually have an agenda that I find offensive. And a lot of mainstream research is written as if it's neutral, but it's actually, got a very damaging agenda. So I don't think that any of us actually, we don't work from a position of neutrality. It's not possible. We are living in this world, and of course, I mean, the scientists, the very sciencey people would disagree with us, but I think those of us in humanities, definitely, we have a standpoint. Very often we are doing this research to bring something about, and so I think that that's absolutely fine. Also, when you find your people, where you find where you belong, that is probably like got a long history. There's a whole kind of tradition of people who've been working from that perspective. So you're not alone. It's not like you woke up one day and decided, I will plant my flag here. You're not just planting it in the middle of nowhere. You're planting it in some tradition. There are others. There might be a small group, but there are others who are thinking what you're thinking and approaching research in the way that you're doing it. So you're just adding to that conversation, and I sometimes ask myself, why are we so hesitant to state our standpoint or our approach, and I realize it's because we've been trained for so long to think, that objectivity and neutrality are things that we should be, that that we should be aiming for. That's kind of deep, deep, deep down. We kind of still have vestiges, you know, of those kinds of beliefs, which, you know, I think we struggle to shrug them off, is what I'm saying. So I hear what you're saying, but I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking a standpoint. In fact, I would encourage it, particularly if you can take that stand by acknowledging the people who've gone before you, you know, acknowledging that family of that tradition of research that you are locating yourself in. That gives your position strength and validity and so on. Am I answering your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Oh, please, Lengiwe, please talk.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. And I actually thought, let me just share my journey. I actually learned of reflexivity very late in my master's degree. And it was at a very, very bad time because I was already starting with my data collection. And when I go to the ground, I realized that I was not really received, you know, for the purpose that I was doing my research for. And obviously because there were conflicting background, I had been in many projects and I did my study in technology. And I actually ran so many projects that was trying to implement technology. So obviously my face was known, you know, for all these disruptive technologies that the company has been trying to pilot, or rather to push into people's throats. And pretty much that's how people, you know, think when you're bringing, you know, systems and things like that. And really the way I was received was, it got me to have to go back to my supervisor and say, wait, I'm not being received properly. And some of the sentiments that were coming when I was collecting my data were like, oh, there we go, the management again. So you're back. Now I'm sure you're coming with another technology initiative. Oh, we're sick of it. So I could see that I'm very much conflicted. And that's where the guy said, no, let's take, you know, a step back. Yeah. Can we go back and relook at all the conflicting points that will make people not receive you for the purpose of why you're actually conducting your research. So I think if you basically look at it even before you start, you know, maybe from a topic point of view, to say, why am I even, you know, exploring this topic? Yes. You know, why is it of an interest to me? Because that's where you will start to say, no, but it's because I've got a standpoint, which might be a bias, you know, and that's how you will, when you actually get to the ground and you're collecting your data, you start to say, maybe I'm not the right person to collect this because I'm very much inflicted. I'm very much conflicted in how I will be, you know, perceived and received. So I think it's a good thing that the research council is actually bringing this, you know, maybe very early, maybe before we can actually go even very further with our studies in our respective studies, because then it makes you actually think about all the conflicting points. Yes. I thought I should just share that.
Thank you so much for sharing it. And I think, you know, reflexivity is very often about ethics, and there are no easy answers. It's always a dilemma. So you can't say, you know, this is the answer. You have to say, this is my experience and this is how I negotiated it. And so the point that I made earlier was, you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to make, you know, some errors in the way you think about things, or being late to acknowledge something, or your understanding happening, you know, as you go along as opposed to beforehand. So it's messy, it's difficult, but as you say, if we can start from the time that we are already working on our proposals, you know, writing, reading the literature, thinking about what theory we're going to use, and then before we go into the field, anticipating, you know, where there might be dual role tensions, where there might be positions that we hadn't anticipated, where people might position us, where we might position them, where there might be unusual interactions, where there might be differences in power. where we might be expected to be, you know, an expert on something, or we might be the face of something else, where we might be misrecognized, where we might be dismissed, where we might not have legitimacy, and people might question why we are doing that research. So those are all things, you know, that I think that we can give thought to even before we get into it. And I encourage you, please feel free to email me, as I said, and I really hope that we will have another opportunity to carry on the conversation. Thanks so much to all of you for the wonderful conversation and the inputs on the chat. It's 4:30. So I think that we're going to call it a day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. I will be sending out the recording tomorrow, but just to thank you, Tracy, you know, I was learning a lot as well in this presentation because I'm also working on my PhD, and it was quite nice to hear about some of the things that people are battling with, as I am also currently on my field work and conducting data, which has been something that I've been navigating, you know, my positions, my assumptions when it comes to the research. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. To everyone else who's here today, have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. If you are writing, all the best. Have a good day and a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asipe. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.